Many years ago, I engaged in an extended period of playing online poker. So this is a card game that you play online, you're betting money, and you're playing against other human players, or perhaps some bots are thrown in there as well. Now, I was interested in learning how to play poker, at least at an adequate level. I was betting 2 cents and 4 cents per hand, so it was extremely low stakes, but I played enough hands to get a relatively statistically significant idea of how I was at a player. I also spent quite a bit of time reading up about the art of playing poker, some of the basic ideas of strategy, bluffing, and statistics. And one of the key things that is very particular to poker, but which also applies to a lot of other things that you would do in life, is this idea of separating process from outcomes. So in poker, even if you play many, many thousands of hands over several days or even weeks, it is possible to play a near optimal strategy and not make any obvious mistakes, except mistakes that only become apparent with the benefit of hindsight, and still lose a lot of money. And one of the challenges this poses, especially for new players who are learning how to play the game, is separating a particular outcome from playing a bunch of hands from whether they were playing the right way, because those two things are only very weakly connected, especially in the short term. This core concept of separating process from outcome is a really key one for just about any professional career, including academic and research careers, and it is a topic of my Hacking Academia video for today. Separating process for outcome in some ways is actually a more or especially challenging concept for academics and researchers, because a lot of them will bring a fairly logical, methodical, evidence-based approach to their career. And this, of course, means that you're tempted to take any particular bad outcome and make a bunch of changes to how you do things without assessing whether that bad outcome is actually a meaningful signal or whether it is something that just comes with the territory of following a good process, but nevertheless having setbacks along the way. One way of thinking about this is to consider the concept that you're going to make a bunch of decisions, make a bunch of applications for grants, submit papers throughout your professional research career or academic career. And those are going to come with criticisms and backlash and critical feedback, regardless of how perfectly you develop those grants or write those papers or submit those proposals. And the key here is to work out whether the feedback you're getting, the critical feedback, whether it's actually meaningful and you should change your ways, or whether it is just something that comes with the territory. And I'm going to give you a few examples that illustrate this in a concrete way in the context of academic research. The first one is perhaps one that you might not get too often early in your career, but this is the feedback for a funding proposal. It could be a grant, it could be a fellowship, that you are too successful, or the group that you're within is too successful, already has too much funding, and therefore are not as worthy a recipient of the funding you're applying for. Now, in this scenario, I'm assuming that you are actually in significant need of this extra funding. You're not just gratuitously applying for funding that you don't actually need. But when people first get this sort of feedback, and early in your career, initially it might be because the group you're in is very successful. But then as you progress in your career, you might also get that on an individual level. Someone saying, well, you've already got lots of grants and funding, you don't need any more. Now, the sort of instinctive reaction to this for many people is to consider downplaying their level of success, hiding some of their success in order to at least superficially reduce the likelihood of that criticism. But that's really not looking at the whole picture. So the whole picture is that a lot of grant funding and research funding and industry project funding considers a lot of other key factors, not just whether you are perceived to have no funding or whether you are perceived to have too much funding. So one of the other key factors would be the likelihood that you are going to be able to successfully fulfill all the things that you've promised in your proposal or your project, and the ability of you to lead and successfully perform all the key milestones. And that is an area where being successful and having plenty of evidence of being successful and highly experienced is going to help. And so you have these two conflicting or seemingly conflicting things. One is if you're too successful and too experienced and too active, you might worry about people saying, well, you don't need any more projects. And then on the other side, if you are perceived as being not successful and not experienced, people may not want to risk giving you a lot of money or with a critical project for an industry partner because you don't appear to have enough experience under your belt. Now, it obviously depends on the context, but in a lot of the research ecosystems that I am familiar with, there is a general level of some risk aversion in the system. And so if you have to choose between those two critical feedback pieces of feedback, you're almost always better off erring on the side of getting that feedback that you're already too experienced and too successful, rather than you're not qualified enough, you're not experienced enough. So this is an example where if you do get a grant rejected or a proposal rejected, and one of the reasons that apparently is put forward is that you're too successful or too experienced, or perhaps the reviewer doesn't think you need any more funding, that is just something that is going to come with the territory. And you should not necessarily react too strongly to that in terms of how you pitch yourself and submit for things in future. Another commonly encountered example is where a proposal or project that you propose gets rejected because it is criticized by, say, one reviewer or assessor as being too close to your core area of work and too heavily overlapping with stuff that you have done or are in the process of doing in your research. And again, you've just had a proposal rejected. It's tempted to sit down, go through all of the comments and then make a bunch of changes to your application and your application strategy going forwards. In this case, you might decide to only pitch grants in areas far from your research area. And again, this is not necessarily a good idea for something to do. In this case, it's quite possible that your process, your way of going about things in pitching interesting, slightly novel research that builds heavily on your existing expertise and sort of world-class capability in a certain area is indeed or was indeed the correct way or the correct process to follow. You've had a bad outcome, but that outcome does not necessarily mean that the process or approach you took was incorrect. A third example in academic careers would be something like this. Someone goes for promotion. They are a researcher who's very heavily on the industry side of things. They do a lot of applied commercial work. They're not particularly prolific in publishing. They don't have a large quantity of papers. They don't have too many high-profile papers. And in the outcome, they perhaps get some feedback in their rejection that they're too industry focused and they need to do a bunch more publishing. And this is a scenario that plays out every single day in academia. And again, the process you engaged in was probably to double down on your strengths and really emphasize the fact that you're doing impactful translational commercial research. You're also active in fundamental research. You are doing some publishing, but really your core value proposition is in the translational applied research. And that again could be the correct process and correct approach to follow, despite the fact that you had a negative outcome. One of the nuances here is that the people giving you feedback will be looking to explain and justify the rejection decision, but those reasons will not always be deeply thought out and actually the core reasons for why you had that particular outcome. So this is a third example of how a negative outcome should not necessarily mean that you should reevaluate your whole process. So you're probably thinking, well, that all sounds fine in retrospect if someone experienced is telling you this, but how do I know at the time whether the outcome was just something that was inevitably going to come with the territory or the process that you're following? And how do you know whether the outcome is actually a meaningful signal that you should really change things? Well, The first and foremost suggestion is you need to talk to and ask experienced people around you, because they will be very good at giving you a perspective on whether you need to change everything or whether you should just keep doing what you're doing and back yourself, and they will point out that the outcome was just inevitable volatility or random variation from your many applications and submissions. Ideally, this experienced person you ask is not conflicted and is perhaps not in the direct decision or line management chain that led to the negative promotion application or the negative grant submission. You really want an external partner who can really, or external expert who can really objectively comment on the situation. If you don't have that expert you can go to, and that is something you should try really hard to do because it's going to be very helpful for many things throughout your career. One of the other things you can do instead, or in addition to asking that expert, is role play the situation where you look at the outcome, you really take it to heart, and you make a bunch of changes. So you sort of think through that scenario, visualize what that would look like, how you would change your promotion application, or how you pitch yourself for an award, or how you would write a grant application. And then you see or think about the flip side or the reverse side of the coin. So what are the sort of opposite types of criticism that you can anticipate you might receive if you make all of these changes? And at the very least, this will give you a more balanced view of the situation where you're not just sort of knee-jerk reacting to the negative outcome, and you can weigh up both sides of the coin and make at least a more balanced, informed decision. Separating outcomes from process or process from outcomes is something that will naturally get a little bit easier in a typical career progression for one key reason, or two key reasons. First of all, you'll have a lot more experience under your belt. So instead of having to rely entirely on asking expert people around you with more experience, you'll be able to start making some of these insights or observations yourself. But the second reason is really that the volatility will smooth out. And so in an early career research stage, you might have one critical proposal or one critical decision per year, for example. And in that situation, it's very hard not to take the negative outcome really to heart and make a bunch of changes in reaction to that. Later on in your career, when there's a bunch of outcomes happening sort of irregularly, but frequently every year, it's a little bit easier to take that 30,000 foot perspective and realize that you will get a bunch of negative outcomes. Some of the negative outcomes will be hugely meaningful in terms of how you should change your strategy. And some of them will just come with the territory. And there'll be things that you'll just chalk up to bad luck or random variation, or however you like to think about such things.